I guess what we try to have annually is our PBC Thought Leadership Forum. Unfortunately, this year it's fully virtual, but hopefully next year we'll be able to see you all face to face again. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country we're presenting from today. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this beautiful coastline and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. So today we're going to be hearing from our fabulous colleagues at Hogan Assessments, Doctors Ryne, Sherman and Karen Fuhrmeister, who'll be speaking on the new world of work and what Hogan is seeing at present in the market and Hogan's response to this. This will be followed by PBC's own head of research, Dr. Lynne Cruickshank, who'll be speaking to some of the latest research findings we at PBC have published, looking at public versus private sector leadership, differences in gender, some sector-specific research, and finally our latest research on what the Hogan 360 data is showing us compared to when we compare Australia to the rest of the world. Finally, we'll have Peter Berry, our MD, who'll be sharing some of his latest insights into leadership and the role of effective leaders in building high-performing teams. Before we get started, I just want to discuss some brief housekeeping for the session. Today's session is going to be recorded, and we'll also ask that you ensure that you remain muted for the session. We will be taking questions through the chat function, and we've got our fabulous colleague Josh on the chat who'll be able to interact with you on the chat, and he'll address any questions. We can address any questions that you might have either at the conclusion of the session if there's time, or we'll come back to you after today's session. So on that note, let me introduce you to our first speakers from Hogan Assessments. Dr. Ryne Sherman is the Chief Science Officer and is an international expert on personality assessment, leadership and organisational effectiveness. He's a recipient of many awards, including the Rising Star Award by the Association for Psychological Science and a Sage Young Scholars Award. Dr. Karen Fuhrmeister is Senior Consultant with Hogan's International Distributors team, and in her role works really closely with us here at PBC to support the delivery of science-based solutions for our clients. Prior to joining the International Distributor team, Karen served as a Senior Consultant on Hogan's Data Science team with an emphasis on talent analytics. She presents at conferences and events across the US, including TEDx talks. So on that note, welcome Team Hogan. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. And Karen, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Jo. Hello, everyone. We're so excited to be here. Thank you for spending this time with us. We really wish we could be there in person with you, but we'll take what we can get as far as still being able to participate virtually in these events again. So today, Ryne and I are going to be talking a little bit about the emerging trends in the assessment space and what Hogan is doing specifically to address those trends. First, though, we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the impact and the changes that the past few years have had on the world and on organizations. So for many people, myself included, the shift to remote work really happened overnight. We left work in March 2020, not realizing it would be the last time we would be together in person for over a year. And although, remote work has become more popular, what was becoming more popular up to this point, the COVID-19 pandemic really forced a lot of companies to participate in a large-scale social experiment. The first few months of 2020 were really marked by ambiguity and panic, both from leaders and individuals, because we were facing situations we hadn't really seen before. So a clear example of this would be with Bird electric scooters. About 400 employees showed up to hear what they thought was going to be an update on what was happening in the current environment. And what they didn't know was it was actually an update to announce layoffs across the company. It's a clear example of a leader panicking and making a snap decision there. But individuals were also panicking. An example can be seen in the hoarding type behaviors that the U.S. specifically saw with the toilet paper crisis. People were buying way more of a product than they actually needed. And, as this behavior is seen by other people in checkout lines with their carts full of toilet paper, other people, that causes other people to want to join in and buy more than they need. So what that means is the consequence is that a lot of the shelves do start to become empty, and that reinforces the behavior of those who really initially started the panic and signals to other people that, again, they should continue to join in. So as organizations panicked, they began doing, taking steps like canceling orders from their suppliers or laying off their workers. And they began to find that data was really valuable to help keep them afloat in the current situation. A lot of organizations shifted their production to things in demand. For example, we saw distilleries who were producing hand sanitizer and clothing companies who brought out lines of masks or who sewed them for the medical workers to meet that need. We also saw a strong need in organizations to start upskilling those workers and using the individuals that they already had, really rather than hiring new ones. So as an example, as people started to shift away from dining in and gravitated instead towards takeout and delivery services, restaurant servers were converted into delivery drivers. Employees began to be expected to be more agile and start to meet problems head on. Another aspect that another change that the pandemic has had is that for many companies, team-based work has become a key concern. They really had to reimagine how to manage their remote workers and how to help workers collaborate virtually. Managers have to be aware of how to handle tasks and avoid, replicating the work that their team members are doing or slowing down response times, which means increasing the communication between employees and not allowing them to become siloed as they stay at home. Companies need to find a way to help teams work together to face new daily challenges. And of course, the geographic spread of employees complicates this. Managers have to be aware of time zones and differing work schedules of their teams in order to facilitate meetings. And for teams with members in multiple locations, meeting times have to be used wisely and evaluated to make sure that a meeting is actually necessary. I'm sure we have all experienced a meeting that we thought could have probably just been an email. So teams start needing to have access to and be familiar with technology to stay connected. That includes software like Microsoft Teams, but also things like laptops with video capabilities, extra monitors, and noise-canceling headphones. And the less technology is a barrier, the more virtual meetings can mimic in-office interactions and facilitate better communication. Remote work has also meant that companies can employ individuals who don't want to relocate or retain employees who might want to continue working for the company, but maybe in a location closer to family or near a beach. This really leads us to changing and evolving team culture and how teams interact with each other. In a remote environment, the potential for both task-related and personal conflict increases because there are more barriers to communication and tracking tasks. As a result, virtual teams really need to prioritize creating a virtual workspace for themselves that encourages frequent, productive feedback between their team members. And managers need to focus on prioritizing the employee perception of belonging in the team. Teams have to move from in-person meetings to relying on written forms of communication, and technology has been key to keeping those employees connected to each other. Both leaders and employees need support to learn how to focus and communicate in ways that use their time efficiently. According to research published by the HR Executive, 76% of employees are in regular virtual meetings, and 30% are reporting nearly a third of their workday is spent on camera. 38% of people said that they are experiencing video call fatigue since the start of the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you can also relate to those statistics. A set cadence of meetings can really help set expectations for communication and ensure that teams stay connected in the virtual environment. The changes that we've seen in how leaders interact with and guide their teams really emphasizes a key point that Hogan has really been trying to make for years. Although the literature defines leadership in terms of the people who are in charge, Hogan's stance is that leadership is a resource for the group, not a source of privilege for the incumbent. Leaders should be defined in terms of their team's performance and evaluated in terms of that performance. But unfortunately, this really isn't often done. We believe that personality can be a key differentiator to help us find those leaders who are focused on making their team successful. So where does that all leave us? What is our current state? What are we working with today? Well, COVID-19 has and continues to impact businesses globally. We're seeing a lot of supply chain issues right now. And some people are really adapting better than others to the current situation. We all have a breaking point, and this pandemic has really tested that breaking point for many of us. Hogan's definition of leadership really focuses in on how the leader impacts the team. And because team performance has become so vital to organizational performance, personality is also consequential to that org performance. So organizational changes are impacting the solutions that companies are looking for, and as a result, the way that we do assessment has also had to adapt. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryne to talk about the new market trends and how Hogan has done some of those adaptations.
Thanks, Karen. Also, thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Thanks to Peter and Shane for having us join in this thought leadership forum. Also, a big thanks to, I think Joe is still operating the slide deck for us. So thanks so much for doing that as well. As Karen mentioned, yeah, there are a whole host of marketing trends. Obviously, lots of things are changing in the market related to COVID. And a lot of trends that have been going on for a while, they sort of wax and wane and they come and they go. But one trend that has stuck around is this one here for the last maybe decade on algorithms using artificial intelligence, data mining, using social media or any other sort of big data sources to assess people or to use that for any kind of personnel function. And a lot of concern about bias and how that might be impacting the way companies are treating individuals or how individuals either get promoted or get placed into jobs. And so I think it's really important to talk about this trend because there's a lot of concern coming out now about or even pushback against these kind of methods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we see going on with these trends and how Hogan is responding to those trends. So a couple of things that we need to get up front, which is that number one is that we have to make decisions. We don't have any choice, right? So you have to decide what to eat for lunch. You have to decide where you're going to work. You have to decide where to go to school. You don't have any choice but to make choices. Sort of riffing off of Jean-Paul Sartre, the Canadian rock band Rush has a famous line that says, even if you choose not to decide, you've still made a choice. So no matter what, even not choosing is a choice. So we have to make decisions, and that includes decisions about people or personnel decisions. So who should we hire? Who should we fire? Who should we promote? Who's high potential? Who's a safety risk? These are critical questions that organizations are asking themselves all the time, and they have to make those decisions whether we include assessments or not. Some years ago when I was in graduate school, a professor was talking about assessments, and he was talking specifically about the psychometric properties, and he was talking about reliability, and he said something to the effect of, if a reliability was below a certain threshold, he would not use that assessment to make personnel decisions. And I remember writing that down in my notes and thinking, oh, that's a very good point. I understand what he's saying. And since then, I've decided that he was completely wrong. That doesn't make any sense at all because you have to make a decision no matter what. And if your choices are making a decision at random or making a decision with an assessment that doesn't have reliability that meets some arbitrary threshold, I would much prefer the assessment that gives me some information versus a coin, which is giving me really no information, right? So we have to make decisions, and all of these decisions are made with some sort of algorithm. I just mentioned a coin, right? You could decide who to hire or who to promote based on a coin flip. That's an algorithm for making a decision. There's a lot of talk about algorithms today, typically referring to sort of mathematical algorithms or quantitative algorithms. But any kind of decision we make is done using an algorithm. Deciding what to eat for lunch is done using an algorithm. We just don't know what that is mathematically. I don't know what you do. Maybe you think, well, yesterday I had that, so I don't want to have that again. Or maybe you think yesterday I had that and it was good, so I'm going to have that again. Everybody has a different algorithm. And that's a really important point there, is that we're making these decisions with some sort of algorithm in our mind, but we don't always know what those algorithms are. And so when we're thinking about algorithms, and we're talking about both mathematical and the sort of ones that exist in our heads, there are three really important things to keep in mind. One is that some algorithms are more accurate than others. Some algorithms are more transparent than others. And some algorithms are more unbiased, or we might say more fair than others. So I'm going to start by talking about that accuracy and transparency part, and then I'm going to jump in to talk about bias and fairness. So starting with accuracy and transparency, thinking about the algorithms that we use at Hogan, right? So people take our assessments. Those assessments are then quantified, right? Whether you answer true or false or strongly agree or strongly disagree, all of those things are then quantified and used to generate a score. A score might be a recommendation for a job. A score might just be say that you're high on adjustment or that you're low on ambition or whatever it is. All of these algorithms that we use have been tested and assured for quality. That is, we test them, we make sure that they are accurate as they can possibly be. When we talk about accuracy, what do we really mean accuracy for? What we mean is accuracy for predicting some outcome that an organization might care about. So one really big outcome that organizations care about is job performance. Another really big outcome that they care about is reputation. How is this person going to be seen among other employees at work? And other outcomes that we occasionally get as well concern things like safety issues. Is this person involved in a lot of accidents, or is costing the company lots of money via sort of safety risks? So, for example, in the cybersecurity area, maybe there's lots of risks involved, and having the right person in the right job can save a company a lot of money in those circumstances. So our assessments are designed, the algorithms inside our assessments are designed to predict those things. How do we know that? We know that based on a whole bunch of research that mostly people on my team have done. So we have more than 400 criterion-related validity studies in our archive. I don't think any company in the world has done as many criterion-related validity studies as we have. And I say criterion-related validity studies, and I know a lot of people might go, I have no idea what that is. So let me take a moment to explain what I mean in really simple terms. What this means is we measure personality, we apply our algorithms, and then later on, we measure performance, and we see how do our algorithms actually relate to performance. Do they actually predict performance in that job, or do they predict reputation, as I'll talk about in a moment? So in these criterion-related validity studies, we're really predicting some job performance outcome. And these studies are really hard to do. They take a long time. Sometimes there's months between when the assessment is made and the performance variables are measured later on. So when we're talking about criterion-related validity studies, it is a lot of work. And so when I say we have more than 400, I'm really proud of that, because that means we are doing that work all the time. And it's really hard for anybody to catch up with us, because we've done so many over the last 30 years or so. So that's one part of what I mean when I say our assessments are accurate. Another part of what I mean is to say that our algorithms or our assessments are accurate at predicting reputation. We do this in a couple of ways. One is what we call adjective checklist research. This is people who know you. We have them after, let's say you've completed our assessment. We have people who know you rate you on a whole bunch of adjectives. And so when people get feedback on our assessments that say, hey, you're high in adjustment, that means other people will see you as A, B, C, right? They'll see you in this way. What we literally mean is other people who get scores like you are described using these terms. And that comes from this research. So when we say our assessments predict reputation, this is literally what we're talking about. We are taking the words that people use to describe people with scores just like you got and saying this is how people like you are described. A very similar pattern is used from some 360 research, and I think Peter is going to go into that a little later on in this session today. But it's the same logic, right? We assess you, we apply some algorithms, and we predict how your coworkers, maybe your managers, maybe your peers, maybe even subordinates view you at work. And again, our assessments have been shown time and time again to predict all of these things. Beyond that, when we're talking about transparency, I can tell you exactly how every single algorithm at Hogan works. That is, if you give me the inputs, you say these are the Hogan inputs, I can tell you exactly how they affect an output. Now, I'm going to pick on interviews a little bit here today, but it could really be the same for any other kind of assessment method. Lots of assessment methods aren't transparent. We don't know, right? For an interview, for example, I have no idea what a candidate says, or what a candidate does, or what a candidate wears, or what a candidate looks like, or how their voice sounds, or any of those kind of factors impact that interviewer's decision, whether or not the hiring manager's decision, whether or not they're going to hire them. So whereas with an assessment like ours, where the algorithms are designed to be really accurate and really transparent, I can tell you exactly how a person got the score that they got. Go to the next slide. Sorry about that.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, there we are. Thank you. So now I want to turn over to bias, because there's a lot of talk right now about algorithm bias, and there's a lot of good reason for that. I think there's lots of examples. One of the famous ones was when Amazon was they had built an algorithm designed for recruiting people to join their team, and the algorithm was biased against women. It was by far preferring men in its algorithm. So there's a lot of talk about algorithmic bias out there. There's one big problem with this, which is that the algorithm itself, the mathematics behind it, isn't biased. What tends to be biased is the criterion, the thing that the algorithm is trying to match. And this is one of the problems with using human judgment. And again, I'm picking on interviews because interviews are really based on a human judgment. We know a lot about human judgment. We know a lot about how human judgments are flawed, how human judgments can be biased. And when we train our algorithms to mimic human judgments, like was done in the Amazon case, this is when problems can occur like that. So it's not really the algorithm that's biased. The algorithm is exposing the bias in the human judgment. And the thing that we know about these kinds of algorithms, these kind of like machine learning or AI-based algorithms, is that they are really, really good at finding any kind of link. So if there's a really small link, a really small bias in the way those judgments are made, these algorithms will grab it and they will exponentiate it because they can find it better than we can. So it's not really algorithms that are biased. It's really the judgment. But when we're talking about bias in assessment, there's really two kinds of bias worth discussing. The first is known as group differences bias, and it's a really simple question. Do groups get different scores on average? Do men and women get different scores? Do black people and white people get different scores? Just two example groups. Do Asians and non-Asians get different scores? So that's one way to think about bias, is whether or not groups get different scores. Now, when we're looking at personality assessments, this isn't just true of the Hogan assessments. This is true of pretty much every personality assessment in the world. We just don't see very large or very consistent group differences. Most groups get almost identical scores on personality assessments, or so minimal, the differences are so minimal that they're really negligible in terms of impact when we're talking about making personnel decisions. So for personality assessments, we don't see a lot of group differences. For cognitive ability assessments, we do fairly frequently see group differences. And that suggests the potential for bias. Now, it doesn't actually mean bias. It is possible that some groups actually do differ on some assessment, whether it's a cognitive assessment or a personality assessment. It's very possible that groups actually do get different scores on average. I can give you an example with a personality one. Executives tend to score differently from individual contributors on personality assessments. So these are different groups and they get different scores on average. So the next question is that really bias, or is that a legitimate difference? Is that a real difference between the groups that has a real impact? That question is investigated by what we call predictive bias. So that is, do the scores have different implications for different groups? So let's go back to my example with executives. If executives score high on ambition and individual contributors tend to score lower on ambition, the question there is the test biased? Is ambition, our measure of ambition, biased against individual contributors or biased for executives, however you want to say it? The answer there is no, because the behaviors that we predict are the same. That is, whether you score high or low on ambition, whether you're an executive or whether you're an individual contributor, your score on ambition means the same thing. It has the exact same implications behaviorally. We've done some, and actually with PBC, we've done some collaborative research with them looking at differences in Japanese managers versus non-Japanese managers in ambition. And what we find there is that sometimes there is a group difference between Japanese leaders and non-Japanese leaders in terms of their average ambition score. But, and this is the most important part, the relationship between ambition and performance, whatever the performance outcome is, sometimes it's career rank, sometimes it's actual job performance ratings, seems to be identical. 360 ratings as well is identical for both groups. So what that means is there's no predictive bias. There is a group difference, but no predictive bias. So the score has the same implications. And what that really means is that effectively, as long as ambition, for example, in this case, is related to the job, is related to performance on the job, there's not really a concern about bias. Yes, the groups get different scores, individual contributors and the managers, but that's related to actual job performance, so it's relevant to keep that in. The good news is, as I mentioned earlier, with personality assessments, when we're looking at typically protected groups like race, gender, gender identity, age, we don't see those group differences, so we don't even have to worry about this predictive bias problem. There's no problem of either kind of bias in those groups. Okay, turning now to, sorry, next slide for me.
Just having a few issues.
It's all right. I sort of to wrap this up, this issue of algorithmic bias, when we look at assessments like the ones we use at Hogan, because we test them all the time for bias, I can tell you that there's no bias in terms of group differences or in predictive bias. We just don't have that in our algorithms. Like, it's just not there when we look for it. And again, we look for it all the time. We're regularly reviewed by third parties. We just don't show those kind of biases. And this is, again, consistent with a broader literature on personality assessment. It's not just Hogan who has some unique special magic touch that shows no bias. When you do typical personality assessments, you just don't find this kind of bias. However, and again, I'm picking on interviews, but it could be any other kind of assessment practice. If I don't know how that practice works, if I don't know how an interviewer's judgment works, I have no idea if there's group difference bias. I have no idea if there's predictive bias. So when we're talking about algorithm bias, we have to first recognize that we're always using algorithms. And we have to say, is this algorithm actually biased? Are there group differences using that algorithm? And do those algorithms have different predictive bias? We know there's a lot of potential for that in manager judgments or interviewer judgments. So one other question that comes to me a lot is, okay, Ryne, so you're saying your tests don't have group differences. Okay, that sounds fine. But what about the performance data? What if the performance data that your tests are designed to predict have group differences? So I'll just give you an example. Let's imagine we have manager job ratings of performance, and let's imagine that the managers rate white employees as higher performers than black employees. Let's imagine that the managers are biased and that they tend to say that white employees do a better job even though they don't actually do a better job, right? So won't your algorithm that you build to predict performance, won't that be biased as well? And the answer here is no, and it's for a little bit of a complex reason. And the real reason, the sort of simple version of it, is that the inputs, the personality data, don't know anything about ethnicity or gender or whatever it is. In this case, they don't know anything about race. Because there's no group difference in the inputs, there's no group difference in the personality tests, the algorithm can never learn this bias that a manager has. This is not the case with a lot of other forms of assessment. So again, if we did interviews, but even if we do things like resume scans, lots of these are very popular technique where somebody submits a resume, the resume is read by a computer, and the resume, the information on that resume is turned into numbers, and an algorithm is built to predict manager ratings of performance. If those manager ratings are biased and there is information in the resume that might be linked to that bias, for example, some names might reveal someone's ethnicity or gender. Schools that people went to might be more indicative of a particular gender or ethnicity as well. And so if those resumes contain information that's related to that manager's bias, that algorithm will learn that. And then that resulting output will reflect that bias. But with personality data, we don't have to worry about this because the personality data isn't associated with gender, race, ethnicity, all these things. That's why having no group differences bias is a big advantage for personality assessment. So if the inputs can't predict the bias parts of the performance ratings, the algorithm will never learn that, and there's no sort of baked in bias. However, this actually does lower the algorithm's accuracy. And again, I won't get into the complexities for why. It's not a good thing. We would like the algorithm to be more accurate, but at least we know it is unbiased. Okay, so I want to wrap up this section on bias with a sort of a brief summary. A lot of people hear me talk about bias, or they hear me talk about algorithms, and they think, wait, is Hogan against algorithms, or is Hogan pro-bias? Is Hogan saying there is no bias? Or what are you talking about? There's no bias at all. That's not the case. We know bias exists. We know it exists in the workplace. We know it's pervasive. We know there's real consequences of bias. The way to combat bias is to have accuracy, to have transparency, and to have fairness being your central tenets. And those are the central tenets to Hogan. As I've described, we do all kinds of criterion studies to ensure our accuracy. We have our technical manuals that are meticulously documented so you can see how our algorithms work. And fairness is the central part of Hogan. Hogan was really founded on this idea of giving candidates who would historically be excluded because of their race or their gender a fair shot at the job. Unfortunately, this is not true for the most common methods of making personnel decisions, which again are mostly based on interviews or based on who you know. We know that those are full of opportunities for bias, whereas these personality assessments aren't. In other words, our assessments are really designed to combat this kind of bias. Okay, so again, sometimes people hear me talk about this stuff and they say, okay, wait a minute. So you're against machine learning. You're against artificial intelligence. You're against big data. You're against algorithms, right? That's what you're saying is these are bad and these are biased. No, that's not the case. There's lots of ways that you can use this kind of technology to make what we're currently doing better. And that's in fact what we are doing in Hogan. So, and Karen's going to show some of this here momentarily. We've implemented a number of technological advancements to improve the test taker experience for candidates. We've gotten lots of feedback showing that candidates do prefer this experience by far to the previous sort of old true false black and white page format. So we can use this kind of information. We can use new technology to improve that experience. We can use this technology to improve the hiring processes for companies. We've implemented a few things that do that. One of the things we've recently implemented is using natural language processing, and Karen's going to show some stuff. I'll just mention one thing that Karen's not going to talk about, which is that when a client comes to us and says, hey, we've got this job we want to hire somebody for, we would normally go through a job analysis process, learn about the job, what are the critical competencies, what are the most important behaviors someone would need to show to be successful on this job. And we would take all these notes and we would code these notes for the most critical scales. What are the most critical parts of that job that will be related to performance based on what people tell us about that job? We have now created a system that's already in place, already implemented, to take those notes, and instead of coding them by hand ourselves, we have the machine do that. We use natural language processing, and the accuracy on this is unbelievably good in terms of mimicking what we would get out of a sort of a longer focus group note coding process. Now it's just automated and done in seconds. It tells us based on what you said in this job analysis, based on those focus group notes, this is what the critical scales are. These are what the critical behaviors you're going to need to see to be a high performer on that job. So that's a really cool, big process improvement. And then finally, we have used machine learning to optimize our current assessments and selection methods. And I'm going to show a little bit of that here on this next slide. This is with what we call the Candidate Assessment Suite, something we launched a little over a year ago. And if you're familiar with Hogan, you might have heard about something called Express, or you might have heard about something called a configure. Express is old scoring algorithms for job families. So you tell us about the job, and most jobs can fall into one family, like professionals or what else do we have?
Admin.
I can't think of any other ones. Technology and techs and specs is what we call it. managers and executives, right? So I think there's 6 of them in Express, and I think we have 6 in the new one as well. So most jobs fall into one of these job families, and we could score that with Express. And Express it's been a very good product. It's still available today for predicting performance in these jobs. If you had a competency-based job where you said, well, these are the critical competencies for this job, I don't want to put it in a job family, I just want it to be based on these competencies, we had a solution, and we still have a solution called Configure that would predict those competencies, predict performance on those competencies. But what we did was we said, well, let's imagine we're going to redo those. Let's redo those algorithms. And those algorithms were based on classic regression techniques that are well validated and well known. We said, but let's use these new methods. Let's use these machine learning kinds of methods. In fact, we even explored things like neural networks as well. Let's see how well we can do. How much better would our algorithms be if we did this? And the results we found were amazing. So we took our current Express and we went to our job performance archive and said, how well does Express predict performance in those job families with what we currently have compared to these new algorithms? And as you can see there, it went from 0.12 to 0.35. These are correlation coefficients, uncorrected for reliability. Nearly triple the predictive power on these new algorithms. And if we look at Configure, jumping again to the conclusion here, we went from 0.13 to 0.26, actually exactly doubling our predictive power in terms of our ability to predict competency. So really big advantages. I mean, I'm really proud of these algorithms and really proud of the work that my team did to build these, because this seriously improves the quality of the selection decisions clients who use our assessments are getting. And I think that's it for me. I think I'm turning it back over to Karen now to show you a little bit more about how we use these today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryne. So let's take a closer look at how Hogan has implemented some of these trends into our current assessment solutions. At the end of 2020, Hogan launched our Hogan Talent Platform, which will eventually be the interface for Hogan moving forward. And as a first step for that, we introduced the Candidate Assessment Suite. So what we wanted to do with the Candidate Assessment Suite was really create a platform that could leverage some of these trends and some of these techniques. So, for example, we wanted to increase prediction by using machine learning algorithms and Hogan's archive of over 400 criterion-related validation studies, and really create predictive algorithms using weighted combinations of the subscales from the HPI and the HDS main scales. And like Ryne mentioned, we have predictive algorithms created for 6 job families, which includes entry-level supervisors, professionals, sales, technicians and specialists, operations and trades, and customer support. And we have more to come, and we're working on new ones all the time. That method really helps us to weight and use only those inputs that create the most value for the client. And so it helps them make more informed hiring decisions based on the most valid and transparent personality assessment data in the industry. We're also using processes like the natural language processing to do things like code focus group notes, something that would have taken a researcher several days to go through notes and identify the scales that went along with it. We can now let a computer run that and have it back to us in a day. We're also working to create a feature on Hogan Talent that would allow clients to upload job descriptions or resumes, and we would recommend, the algorithm would be able to help recommend the best job family to use and to hire on. We're also very proud of the new candidate experience on the platform. So if you've ever taken our assessments before, you might remember the previous experience. We only had 2 options and, you scrolled up and down on a screen. But our new layout really incorporates a 4-point scoring, so ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we've optimized it for desktop, laptop, and mobile use. And, it uses a lot of features to help make it easy and fun to take. An added bonus is that candidates no longer have to keep track of their IDs or passwords. They can log in and get sent the assessments via their emails. So our platform was really specifically designed to be easy for recruiters and HR to navigate. We really wanted to create something where they could quickly create new projects for hiring roles and do that on their own without, needing to bring in Hogan to put that together for them. You can tailor the project to really what matters most for the role in the organization. So what competencies are going to be most critical for performance in the role that you're looking at. You can send assessments to the entire candidate pool at once, sort, filter, screen candidates very quickly on multiple layers of data. So you can see a screenshot here of what that platform looks like. And really, we're trying to help you get a deeper understanding of the candidate's predicted performance. And the platform itself is also available for use on mobile devices. So as people are, working remotely or, sitting in the doctor's office, they can pull up their phone and scroll through this as well. So really to wrap all this up, Hogan is driven by our core purpose, which is helping people and organizations succeed using data-driven talent insights. And implicit in this purpose is the idea that success should be accessible to all rather than a select few. So over the years, we've assessed nearly 10 million people, and we provide insights about individual strengths and challenges to really help people find the right job, help them grow professionally, and lead happier, more productive careers. Like Ryne mentioned, we really strive to be as transparent as possible in our work to demonstrate our commitment to quality and ethical research. For example, each assessment manual we publish contains detailed information on the development, reliability, validation, and norms for each assessment. So if you're using the assessments properly, we can help clients provide unbiased evaluations of their potential by focusing on really true predictors of success in the workplace and offer organizations the means to cultivate healthier and more inclusive workplaces. So with that, thank you so much for your attention today. And now I will turn it back over to Joe.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Ryne. We really do love all the support that you give us here at PBC. And I think we're really getting, looking forward to getting stuck into the Hogan Talent Portal and starting to see some of those solutions really come to life for our clients. So thanks for your work on that. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Lynne Cruickshank, PBC's Head of Research. Lynne's experience in undertaking various types of research and analytics projects designed to provide insights that individuals, teams and organisations can use to understand and enhance their performance and development. Lynne works extensively with Hogan to collaborate on combining Hogan and Hogan 360 data to deliver some fantastic research. And today her session is really going to focus on providing a bit of an update on some of that research that we've delivered lately. Thanks, Lynne.
Great, thank you, Jo. So as Jo mentioned, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be touching on 5 of our newer pieces of research, looking at some of the highlights and key takeaways. And the first piece of research that I'll talk about was really looking at differences and similarities between public versus private sector leaders, particularly looking at the personality assessments, so similarities and differences when it comes to day-to-day personality tendencies, derailers, motivators and drivers, as well as when we look at their results on the Hogan 360, and really designed to provide insights that can be used to help understand when it comes to things like the selection and development of leaders across sectors. So firstly, looking at the results, when we're looking at differences in relation to day-to-day tendencies, what we found was for leaders in the public sector, they tended to be rated or score relatively higher around tendencies associated with being quite resilient, handling stress and pressure well, whereas for those in the private sector, they tended to be more around working with that sense of passion, that sense of urgency coming through there. When it came to communication, interacting with others, what we found was public sector leaders tended to be rated higher around tendencies associated with being perceptive and considerate of others, adopting more of that tactful style or that tactful approach, whereas those in the private sector more around being outgoing, actively seeking those opportunities to connect and engage and communicate with others, and adopting more of that forthright or direct communication style. When it came to approach to work, what we found was public sector leaders tended to score relatively higher around things like being more structured, planned, organised in their approach to work, paying attention to things like details, process steps, ensuring compliance, mitigating potential risks, whereas for those in the private sector, relatively more likely to be flexible, adaptable, coming through there. In terms of idea generation, problem solving, in terms of those day-to-day tendencies, what we found were public sector leaders tended to be relatively higher around tendencies of being more innovative, choosing more of those kind of creative approaches when it comes to problem solving, having that interest around the big picture, whereas for those in the private sector, relatively more likely to be pragmatic. And then finally, we found public sector leaders more likely to actively seek those opportunities to stay up to date, to stay across relevant issues, trends, developments applicable to their field or their role. When it came to derailers, so how they may respond when they're under that stress, that pressure, when they're not actively self-managing themselves, what we found was public sector leaders scored significantly higher around scales associated with being more risk averse. So potentially overly cautious, less inclined to perhaps take those risks, those chances that may be beneficial during those times when they are under that stress and pressure. Less likely to show that assertiveness, that decisiveness that may be required during those times, and more reluctant around perhaps acting independently or making those decisions quickly. Whereas for private sector leaders, you may notice a bit of a longer list of what we saw coming through there on the right. So did score significantly higher across a number of the derailers coming through there. More likely when they are under that stress and pressure, may perhaps overplay some of that passion, that sense of urgency that we saw in that day-to-day personality side, to then becoming perhaps more temperamental when there are those setbacks, those difficulties, perhaps those expectations not being met, showing more of that cynicism and that tendency to be more fault-finding during those times, as well as potentially being seen as more stubborn and resentful if there are perhaps things that get in the way of that independence, that ability to focus on their particular priorities or agenda during that time. We also saw higher scores around those scales associated with what we'd call some of those moving against behaviours. So this includes things like being overly confident, perhaps overly self-promoting, enjoying that spotlight perhaps, but not sharing that centre of attention coming through there, as well as with that tendency to be more flexible, quick to act, perhaps overplaying it to the point where being more hasty in making some of those decisions and perhaps overly risk-taking when not thinking through some of those implications as well. And then finally, from the personality side, when we look at motivators and drivers, what we found was for those in the public sector, significantly more likely to have that drive around wanting to help other people. And as a leader, potentially that greater focus around things like staff morale and staff well-being, wanting to provide that quality service that's helping other people. As well as, broadly speaking as well, a focus around that quality, that style, that look and feel, and adopting more of that kind of innovation approach coming through there and some of that creative problem solving. Also scored higher around things like having more of that rational, data-driven, objective approach to problem solving. So wanting some of that rigor and defensibility behind that decision making, those plans, those kinds of things as well. And then in terms of private sector leaders, what we found was they were more likely to be driven around things like standing out, being noticed, having that focus on competition, being the best, getting ahead, that focus on that high performance, that achievement piece coming through there, as well as within the work environment, enjoying having some of that fun, that variety, that opportunity to set their own priorities, set their own pace coming through there as well as encouraging or having that focus around social interaction. So may encourage more of that focus around that collaboration, that networking, seeking those opportunities to engage with others, as well as focusing more on commercial activities. And then when we look at the Hogan 360, so how their performance tends to be rated by others, such as their manager, their peers, and direct reports, and perhaps other key stakeholders, what we found was that those who are leaders within the public sector tended to have a significantly higher overall score on the Hogan 360, as well as across a number of the capabilities that are being assessed there. That said, there were some common strengths and opportunities that we did see come through when we looked at the top-ranked strengths and opportunities for the leaders. So in terms of strengths, regardless of whether they were in the public sector or the private sector, some of the top strengths were around having that solid ability and knowledge and expertise, showing that strong work ethic and being quite action-orientated in getting things done. In terms of opportunities, it tended to be around things like that workload management piece. So stop taking on too much, spreading yourself too thin, delegating more coming through there, as well as around challenging poor performance as well. So these were common opportunities that came up regardless of which particular sector a leader was in. That said, we did also find some differences that came through as well when we're looking at these ranked strengths and ranked opportunities. So for executives in particular, when we're looking at the public sector, they tended to have higher rankings around showing those strong leadership skills and being empathetic and supportive coming through there. And then for managers, what we found in the public sector, they tended to be ranked relatively higher around things like showing those high ethical standards, those strong communication skills, and planning and thinking ahead relative to managers within the private sector. For opportunities, regardless of whether they were executive or a manager within the public sector, they tended to have this relatively higher ranked opportunity around setting those clearer goals and performance indicators coming through there. And then if we look at private sector leaders, in terms of where their relative strengths came through, was around things like being more customer focused, showing that competitiveness and that determination, which again aligns with some of those things we saw coming through in the values as well, around that stronger value, around that competitive piece as well. And then in terms of opportunities, around things like communicating better, improving those people skills and interpersonal skills, which again may relate to some of those differences that we see coming back from the personality side around perhaps that tendency to be a bit more forthright, a bit more direct in their communication style at times, as well as some of those derailers that they may be more likely to exhibit when they are under that stress and pressure. So in addition to looking at differences across sectors, also looked at gender differences when it comes to Australian leaders. And what we found when looking at those day-to-day tendencies, when it came to female leaders, they tended to be significantly more likely to show tendencies associated with being more reflective around their performance and showing more of that sense of passion, that sense of urgency coming through there as well. Whereas for male leaders, more likely to show those tendencies associated with being resilient and handling those everyday stresses and pressures in a calm and composed manner. Additionally, we found for female leaders, they tended to show this style around being more willing to follow others. So showing perhaps more of that kind of collaborative approach when it comes to their leadership style, whereas for male leaders, may be more inclined to adopt more of that directive approach and be seen as quite confident, quite driven around driving those results. In terms of interpersonal style, communication, what we found for female leaders was that they tended to show more of that tendency to be perceptive, considerate, tactful when interacting with others, whereas for male leaders, more likely to be seen as outgoing, as actively seeking those opportunities to connect and engage with others, and adopting more of that forthright or direct communication style. And then in terms of that day-to-day approach to work, or how to tend to think about problems and generate ideas, for female leaders, more likely to be on that pragmatic side, whereas for male leaders, more likely to be around that innovative side and have that focus around the big picture. And then finally, for female leaders, saw this greater tendency around valuing those opportunities to learn, seeking out those opportunities to stay up to date across relevant issues and trends and developments in their field. When we look at derailers, what we found for female leaders is under that stress and pressure, significantly more likely to show those derailing tendencies associated with that risk aversion, overplaying that cautiousness piece at times to the point where they may be slower to make decisions, take those actions, may be less likely to perhaps take some of those chances or adopt some of those changes because of the risks associated with that, and perhaps not as assertive during those times as well when it comes to communicating with others. Whereas for male leaders, under that stress and pressure, more likely to show derailment around perhaps being more cynical and fault finding when it comes to other people, more indifferent to other people's feelings and concerns during those times, and potentially seen as more stubborn and more resentful around things that impact on that independence and that ability to focus on their priorities and agenda. Similarly, we also saw more of those moving against derailers, more likely to come for male leaders. So more likely to perhaps overplay that confidence, perhaps be seen as more self-promoting, not providing others as much of that space and opportunity to also contribute if they're seeking out that spotlight more, and more hasty potentially when it comes to making some of those decisions and taking some of those risks. And then from a values and drivers perspective, for female leaders, significantly more likely to be driven and motivated around that desire to want to help other people make that positive contribution to society. Again, as leaders, may have that stronger focus around things like staff morale and well-being, wanting to provide that quality support when it comes to the customers or the key stakeholders that they're working with, and also a stronger focus around building relationships. So investing that time and energy and effort into building those quality connections, those quality relationships with other people, and having as well that focus around the quality, around outputs, the look and feel, the style of things within the work environment, as well as a focus around innovation. For male leaders, tended to be significantly more driven around things like standing out, being noticed, being, the best, focusing on that competition, getting ahead, driving that high performance coming through there, as well as focusing more around commercial activities, as well as when it comes to problem solving, valuing that data-driven objective approach. So when we looked at differences on the Hogan 360, we did find that female leaders had significantly higher overall scores on the Hogan 360, as well as higher scores across most of the capabilities being assessed. And there were also some differences that we found when we looked at the ranked strengths and ranked opportunities as well. So for female leaders in particular, what we found were more likely to be strongly ranked around having a strength of being empathetic and supportive, which aligns with some of the things we saw coming through in the personality assessment results. Also more stronger around things like being seen as a strong role model, being well organised. However, more likely to have an opportunity around looking more at that bigger picture piece coming through there as well. For male leaders, when it came to their strengths, tended to be ranked relatively higher around things like being steady and calm under pressure, which again can connect back to what we saw in the personality assessment results around more likely to be seen as resilient, calm, composed when facing those everyday stresses and pressures. And the other strength that also came through as relatively higher for male leaders was around being good at problem solving. And then finally, in terms of opportunities, it was around communicating better as well, which again may link back to some of those things we saw coming back through in relation to that day-to-day personality tendency of being perhaps a bit more direct, a bit more forthright, but also potentially around some of the derailers we see as well. When looking at the gender differences research, we also looked around whether there may be differences when we look at those who are, before we go there, what we also looked at was also some similarities that came through in terms of the top ranked strengths and opportunities. So similar to what we saw within the public versus private sector, regardless of gender, what we find is often the highest ranked strengths, there tends to be this consistency around showing that solid ability, experience, knowledge, having that strong work ethic, and being action orientated, as well as these similar opportunities related around that work management, around stop taking too much on, delegating more, and challenging for performance. So really, regardless of whether male or female, which sector we're working on, we tend to consistently find these are some of the top strengths and opportunities that come through. We also looked at top quartile leaders as well to see if there were any differences that came through there. And what we found was, regardless of gender, there tends to be these key strengths that really differentiate those who are those top performing leaders coming through. So it's things around showing those strong leadership, communication and people skills, being a positive role model, setting clear goals and driving those results, as well as being motivating and inspiring to others. Regardless of gender, there were also these common opportunities that also came up for leaders who were within the top quartile. So again, around things like delegating more, sharing their knowledge and resources, so sharing more of themselves and more of their work, giving appropriate feedback, as well as being more assertive, so perhaps having more of that voice and presence coming through there. So the next two pieces of research that I'll quickly touch on were then looking more specific around particular industries. And one of the industries that we looked at was the healthcare industry, which is certainly an industry that's been a lot more in the spotlight given COVID-19, a lot more challenges, a lot more difficulties that they have faced and encountered as a result. And what we did for this particular research was, based on personality assessments, looking at what were some of the differences that we found coming through for the healthcare industry. And what we found was, in terms of the strengths, certainly within the healthcare industry, more likely to have that stronger drive and motivation around helping other people coming through there. Perhaps not surprising, given the reason why a number of people do actually enter into the healthcare industry. But we also found that they tended to be higher around engaging in or valuing that objective, data-driven approach when it comes to decision making as well. And when we look specifically at leaders, some of the differences we found for leaders in the healthcare industry relative to other industries was really this focus around things like high standards, being more procedurally driven, attentive to compliance and risk, which, given the particular environment that they're operating with, often, potentially life and death situations within the healthcare industry as well, important qualities to ensure, that things are operating effectively there as well. And then for individual contributors, what we found was that there was this difference around, for them, more likely to work with that sense of passion and urgency as well. There were also some particular opportunities that came out for the healthcare industry relative to those in other industries, and one of them is really around conflict aversion. So for those within the healthcare industry, more likely to perhaps shy away from, confrontations, having some of those difficult conversations, perhaps voicing, particular concerns coming through there, which may have an impact around perhaps how timely or direct particular issues may be addressed at times. Interestingly, also less likely to show tendencies associated with embracing change relative to other industries, which is interesting given the significant changes that the healthcare industry has needed to go through as a result of COVID-19 as well. And less of a focus around commercial outcomes. And then when we looked more specifically at leaders within the healthcare industry, less likely to engage in delegating some of their workload. So again, in terms of that workload management piece, maybe more of an opportunity for them coming through there, as well as less likely to respond flexibly at times and adapting to some of the changes that they encounter. Leaders in the healthcare industry were also found to be less likely to have this focus around socializing and engaging in those networking activities, which as a leader may impact around how strongly perhaps they encourage and promote that collaboration, that networking and engagement themselves. And then finally, for individual contributors, what we found were that relative to other industries, individual contributors, less likely to show those tendencies around that resilience piece. So when it comes to handling stress and pressure, maybe more of an opportunity where they need some of that extra support. Again, very important in light of the extra stress and pressure that they have been going through in the face of COVID-19. And certainly there has been, I know in the media, things around increased risks of errors for, say, young doctors because of the stress and pressure that they are encountering. The other industry that we also looked at was the infrastructure industry. So for this particular piece of research, what we were focusing on was really around staff retention and engagement, because there do tend to be higher rates of turnover when it comes to the infrastructure industry relative to a number of other industries. And part of this is due to aspects within the actual culture of the industry itself. So, for example, there is a lot of emphasis around project-based work, focusing more around perhaps short-term wins, short-term outcomes, as opposed to thinking more longer-term around things like employee development and the pipeline coming through there. And there was some recent research from the Australian HR Institute. They looked more broadly at what tend to be the more effective retention strategies, regardless of industry, and what they found were the top three tended to be around effective management and leadership, having a positive workplace culture, and opportunities for career progression and promotion. So we looked at the data that we had in relation to, for those in the infrastructure industry, what is it they tend to be more strongly driven and motivated by? So what kind of work environment perhaps will be more conducive to help reduce that turnover, enhance that level of engagement when it comes to staff? And what we found was it tended to be around things like where salaries, benefits, and bonus opportunities are explicit, where there's opportunities for individuals to demonstrate their abilities and career progression, where they can focus on the latest thinking and engage in more of that kind of data-driven analytical problem solving. And for individual contributors in particular, where there is more of that kind of structure and consistency in having that long-term stability. And finally, the last piece of research that I'll touch on is looking specifically at the Hogan 360 when we compare Australian leaders versus leaders from around the world. And what we found was there was no significant difference when we compared Australian leaders in terms of their overall Hogan 360 score to leaders around the world. There also was no difference when we were looking at the leadership quadrants associated with behavioural competencies, so self-management and relationship management, those competencies associated with showing that emotional intelligence, that ability to build those strong relationships, manage oneself professionally. However, there were differences when we looked at the business competencies areas, so things like working in the business, having that operational excellence, as well as working on the business. So bringing that extra value through building those accountable and motivated teams, through strategic thinking, innovation. So when we looked more specifically at some of these sub-themes that sit underneath the Hogan 360 model, where we saw differences coming through were for Australian leaders, more likely to score higher around things like people skills, so that opportunity to build those effective relationships, build those teams coming through there, as well as when it came to things like motivation, so creating those environments that are going to encourage people to perform at their best, as well as capability, so having that knowledge and that skill and ability to perform effectively in their role. However, where they tended to score lower was around things like efficiency. So you may remember that what we found was there does tend to be this consistent theme coming through around this workload management being a key opportunity. So, not taking too much on, spreading themselves too thin, having that time focused on where they can bring the most value. Other areas were also around things like being engaging, having that accountability, again, may connect back to what we see around things like that need to challenge some of that poor performance, providing more of that constructive feedback. And finally, lower around strategy. So focusing on that bigger picture, thinking long term, thinking more strategically coming through there as well. So that is an overview of the research that we've done. I'll now hand you over to Jo.
Thanks, Lynne. Just before we head over to Peter, and Lynne and Peter are just going to do a quick seat change. But while we do that, I did see there were a couple of questions, Josh, on the chat specifically for Lynne, so we might just take 1 minute. We can still hear Lynne, so stay there, Peter, and Lynne might just respond to those. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks so much, Jo. Yes, we've got 2 questions in the chat for Lynne. Thank you, Lynne. Peter has asked, specific to the Hogan 360 data source, in public leaders rating better in a higher proportion of strengths, does this say as much about the raters as it does about the leaders?
Very good question. So I'll have to have a look a bit closer at the data of whether, you're picking up something that potentially maybe public sector raters are nicer people that tend to rate them more favourably, which is why they get those higher scores coming through there. That said, though, I will say that when we look at things like the ranked strengths and ranked opportunities, you can still see connections to some of the things we still see coming through in relation to the personality assessment results. But very good question, Peter. I like it.
And we have looked at some of those differences, haven't we, Lynne, when we look at gender differences. So we have actually looked at the differences between the rater groups as well, haven't we? So yeah, so a good extension on the research. Thanks, Josh.
And one more from Karen. Karen picked up that there seems to be a correlation between the traits of female and public sector leaders and male and private sector leaders. Is this the case or something we've picked up as well?
Yeah, so I did notice that as well. I mean, it came particularly apparent while I was putting the slides together for this particular section. It's like, it's like the same kind of things coming through there. That said, though, I have looked at also more specifically gender differences within the public sector as well as within the private sector, and we still tend to see the same things coming through, regardless of which particular sector they're working within.
Thanks, Lynne.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter's going to shuffle in next to me. Okay, on that note, so thanks so much, Lynne. As many of you know who've worked with PBC for a while, Lynne supports so many of our clients on various customisations, pieces of research, analytics projects, and she's particularly well regarded within the industry, having presented at a range of forums, including SIOP and for the APS. Our final speaker is Peter Berry. So I'm sure you all know Peter, but for those who haven't had the pleasure, Peter's our PBC MD and founder. He specialises in leadership development, coaching, change management, business performance and team building, both in Australia and globally. Peter's experience includes over 20 years as a director and associate with Melbourne Business School, as an associate with MGSN. He's also the author of the Hogan 360 and a number of books. He also co-authors a large number of research papers, including Leadership in Australia, What Makes High-Performing CEOs, and Judge the Leader by the Team. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Jo, and a big welcome to all of our participants today. I know you're tremendously busy. We do value your time, enthusiasm and interest. Jo mentioned at the start, and Jo is one of our brilliant directors in PBC. We're so proud of the work she does. This is an annual thought leadership event. If normally it's in Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, we book a swanky 4 or 5 star hotel and we shout you all a coffee latte or a bit of fruit or a muffin, whatever you want. And because of the virtual world, it's really today just a couple of hours. So, but I do want to thank our extended Hogan family. There's thousands of people that are Hogan certified. We've got coaches, senior HROD people. It's wonderful to have you as part of that family, and we respect you. So there's my little thank you. We did have 600
resignations.
I was going to say resignations. 600 registrations earlier this week. So tremendous enthusiasm in what we've got to say. So I'm talking about leadership and teams, and I firstly want to acknowledge Dr. Robert Hogan. He's still alive and well in Florida at the age of 84. I count him as my mentor and buddy and friend, because whenever we talk, and we're lucky to talk regularly, it always comes down to leadership and teams. And I just want to say that leadership is the most consequential resource in the planet. The articulation of a leader is building a high-performing teams. Leadership is about results. Teams deliver results, therefore judge the leader by the team. And it's the team's responsibility to drive employee engagement, the customer experience, service operational excellence, and bottom line financial results. The good news is that leadership in teams are both measurable and improvable. And that's my passion, really building high-performing cultures that deliver industry leadership. Bob Hogan, the greatest living business psychologist in the world. He's contributed so much in the last 30 or 40 years, and I will be referring to some of his insights. What Bob has done is build an evidence-based approach, a science approach to inform and improve business practices, and that's what I love about the guy. So let's get cracking. A bit of thought leadership. I picked a young fellow called Aristotle. He talked about knowing yourself as the beginning of all wisdom. And I just want to ask the participants on this program this morning, have you ever come across someone who's truly self-aware? They really know their strengths, their weaknesses, they self-regulate, they've got a strong filter in the brain. Equally, at the other end of the spectrum, who's ever met someone that was clueless? Just didn't have a clue about their dark side, their derailing tendencies. They might be bullying, micromanaging, fault finding. And that's why we do agree that knowing yourself or self-awareness is the beginning of all wisdom. And I just want to say a couple of points there. We think that self-awareness begins with assessments. And there's no better place to start with the Hogan personality assessments and the Hogan 360. That way, you get you below the waterline, you above the waterline, and there is no place to hide. The other great thing about self-awareness, it needs to be strategic self-awareness. So, for example, if I get my personality scores, they're all percentiles. Where am I different from other people? You know, rather than in the middle. Same with the 360. Did I get a 90th percentile score? I'm a rock star. Did I get a 10% 360 score? Room for improvement. So that self-awareness is critical. Dr. Robert Hogan, he's so pithy and succinct with some of his quotes. I love this quote. I'll give you a minute to read it. And it's that, in particular, the second paragraph that I really love. So you're going to hear from me in a moment. Leadership drives high-performing teams and employee engagement, and that out of that you get sustainable, superior business results. So Bob and I agree, leadership is the most important subject in town. Why is leadership important? We think that leadership drives engagement and engagement drives performance. All the evidence is in, whether you use Gallup, Sirota, Glint, Aon, Hewitt, all of the big research companies in the world track that causal link, and that's why spending on leadership is important, particularly if it's tied to delivery of strategic KPIs, employee engagement, and producing those bottom line outcomes. Gallup research, I think they're very sophisticated with their research. The first dot point here is awesome. It's just so significant. Gallup's research shows that 70% of the impact on a team can be attributed to the leader. So if you think about the selection of the team, their roles and responsibilities, their processes, their resources, the KPIs they're targeting, whether they're engaged, 70% is impacted by that leader. So you've got to have great leaders in business. Who of you can think of great leaders you've seen and admired? Who can think of very ordinary leaders that perhaps shouldn't even be on the payroll? So engagement has a positive impact right throughout the business, and Gallup are suggesting it's the financials, it's the customer experience, it's the employee productivity and safety, and also the culture around your people, retaining your best people, and keeping lower absenteeism and high wellness. We're lucky to work for Shell. We love working with Shell because they have a very sophisticated people and business analytics team in London. They're a top 10 multinational in the world. They have scale. They use the Hogan personality and the Hogan 360. And they have the same model, leadership drives employee engagement, and out of that comes improved safety and better performance. So the analytical work in Shell is absolutely convincing around the benefits of engagement. Their second dot point there, they disagree from Gallup. They say that the immediate impact of the leader is 50% on the team. Now, I don't care whether it's 50 or 70. It's massive. It's significant. So just think about the best leaders we've seen, and do they drive engagement? And have you seen bad leaders who struggle to keep engagement? And the third dot point, I think this is fascinating with Shell, and we do love getting their insights. They did a little trial, and they moved a poor team leader to a highly engaged team. And guess what happened? Within 6 months, that leader had destroyed the team. The employee engagement had gone down, and all of the KPIs were heading south. The key learning when I work with Shell, leadership has to be measurable and accountable. Do you agree with that philosophy? Is that a philosophy you try to inject into your own business, or if you're a coach, And do you try to take that approach? Driving performance, here's a little bit of thought leadership from me and my team. It's called the LEAP model. It's just an acronym for leadership, engagement and performance. So if I get a clean sheet of paper and I'm working with a new team, it could be a CEO and that executive team, it could be a large division or a geographic unit. Give me the senior manager, and we like to focus on three things. Firstly, leadership. So we talk about measuring leadership effectiveness, improving leadership effectiveness. Then, uniquely, compared to other consulting houses, we really put a laser focus on team effectiveness and improving those team outcomes. And there's three ways to measure leadership. There's the Hogan personality assessments, the Hogan 360, and our very own high-performing team assessment. And I will be talking about this in a moment. Then we link it to strategy. Is the organisation's strategy, purpose, business plans, KPIs crystal clear? Is there a one-year plan consistent with a longer 3 to 5 year plan? Is it a balanced scorecard? There's financials, but there's employees, customers, and operational excellence. A Peter Berry philosophy, have you got a plan on a page? Keep it simple, stupid. Try to get down what success looks like on a single A4 sheet. What does winning look like for the next 12 months? And you use that very simple communication to say it 7 times in 7 ways with the workforce. We want them to be engaged in that intellectual way around the purpose of the organisation. And particularly, we like to show what is it we do that impact the lives of people so we can get people excited about the passion, the impact, the legacy that we can leave. And the fourth point, you need to get your cadence right. Is there an annual planning cycle supported by quality reviews? We're teaching managers to act more like leaders. We're working on the business, not just in the business. We want to be strategic, not just operational. And I've had some of my best successes just introducing those quarterly reviews to give you the strategic cadence to be working on the big picture. The people, it's all about hire hard and manage easy. That's one of my famous little quotes, I think. The interview is the least predictive of selecting good people. It's full of biases and assumptions and wanting to get a quick fix. You've got to use data. You've got to use the personality assessments. You've got to do extensive reference checking, behavioural interviews, and for mass selection assessment centres. The onboarding and motivation, what's the honeymoon effect for people in the first 90 days? Are you winning their hearts and minds? Everybody wants development and career opportunities these days. What can we do to support you, develop you, coach you, train you, nurture you? The better employers are doing that one quite well. And discretionary effort, we want to see that people are happy, excited, passionate, working smart, and they'll go the extra yard, bend over backwards for the customer. And that's part of what you want to see in the people experience. Now, what we do at PBC, we align leadership with strategy and people as our approach to aiming for engagement and business outcomes. So you can't do a leadership program in isolation. You can't do strategy in isolation to delivering better leaders and better cultures. And you shouldn't be just doing HR or people and culture or the employee experience in isolation from what we're here to do. So we call those the three legs to our stool. They need to be integrated, and that would be world's best practice at the moment. Those three together deliver performance, and the performance you want is that balanced scorecard at the bottom. So are you working on a similar model in your organisation or with your clients, making sure they're integrated? Assessments, there's two things that jump out here. Organisations that are spending money on leadership programs or people and culture or team building, they want to see return on investment. The second thing they want to understand, the better ones, is there a linkage between people and business analytics? So if we invest in a leadership program, are we going to see some outcomes? So the approach we take is to say at step one, let's start with the leaders in a business. It could be the senior executives, it could be team one and teams two, so you might get the top 50 or 60. And let's do the personality, the 360, and our high-performing team assessments. So let's put a measure in the line, a SAM, and let's take the pulse, see where they are, and then aim to take them from good to great. Number two, the two key stakeholders in any business are your staff and your customer. What's their experience and how do we measure that? And number three, it should be linked to delivering against the strategy, the KPIs, generating your organisational performance. Can I just say that one of my favourite CEOs tragically passed away 2 weeks ago. His name was Keith Bradshaw. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the South Australian Cricket Association. Now, I know cricket is in the media at the moment, probably for the wrong reasons, but Keith stood out as probably the best CEO across Australia in those cricket bodies, and he practiced this philosophy here. Step one, let's keep measuring the leadership. Step two, connecting it to the other data. And three, using it to drive performance. And I just want to pay a tribute to Keith, one of my favourite CEOs, and certainly practiced what we preach. The concept of Team 1 and Teams 2 is a little bit unique to PBC. So with Team 1, it's the senior team that might be our client. So we work with them to spin our best practices and really develop their self-awareness around becoming better people, better leaders, and generating strong teams. But we always try to get Teams 2 operating quickly with the methodology and the assessments, so we're all in sync, all using the same assessments, the same language. I'll give you one little case study. We're thoroughly enjoying our work with Sydney Trains at the moment. It's a massive government body, the biggest metropolitan CBD train system in Australia. And we started 2 years ago by saying, okay, let's get the chief executive and the executive as Team 1. So we did the personalities, we did the 360, we did the judgment report, which is a terrific little report, and we did the high-performing team assessment. We supported it with coaching and with the goal of improving those 360s and team outcomes over the next year or two. Fortunately, they bought into the concept of let's operate at Teams 2 as well. So for everybody on Team 1, except for the CEO, they all led their own team, which we called Teams 2. And we did the same activity there. The assessments, the coaching, the focus on the KPIs, the focus on the employee engagement. And the trick was to build a critical mass of 60 or 70 terrific leaders, all having the same vision, where shared goals are just as important as individual goals, using the same assessments, and they set targets for how to improve on their 360 and team assessment. That's where the real accountability is kicking in, and we are having some significant success there. Okay, again, a little bit about business. When I work with clients, I always suggest you've got to have your operating cadence right and the discipline right. So we talk about the strategic planning cycle. Once a year, an executive team should go away for a day or two. I know COVID's got in the way of that. We review the past year. We project 3 to 4 years on. We bring it back to the 1 year plan. We spend 50% of our time doing a bit of team building. You might use Hogan personality assessments. And what we're doing there is setting the vision. What does winning look like for the next 1 to 3, 4 years? Dot 2, it's all about building leadership capability. So we plan ahead. What are we doing with our leadership program? Will we be focusing on building high-performing teams as part of our strategic plan? Because we realise that's the key to driving employee engagement and business outcomes. We introduced the language of working in and on the business. Working in is your day-to-day world, hands-on, operational, crisis-driven, firefighting, and working on the business is being strategic. I had the pleasure of interviewing John Cotter from Harvard Business School 2 years ago for a leadership program. Some of you might know his books, Leading Change and The Art of Change. And he said, when you get to be a senior leader, you've got to be a damn good manager and an even better leader. And his quote was, the manager is running the trains on time while the leader is creating the future of transport. And that's what we try to do with the quarterly offsites, get the big picture as well as the granular. The other little trick is at these offsites, spend 50% of time on building the leadership and team, the culture, getting them to know each other, break bread, share a meal. You've got to build that trust, that collaboration, that togetherness, so then they can focus on delivering the strategy. So we talk about culture enabling strategic performance. Obviously, we use assessments and coaching. and the focus is on team 1 and team 2. That's my little best practice checklist, if you like, for what organisations should be doing around their cadence. Disengagement. I'm really upset with these statistics. It's just such a daunting challenge. All of the big survey providers in the world agree that 30 to 35% of employees are disengaged. They would quit their business, quit their boss. They whinge about their organisation to other people. They're probably not putting in much discretionary effort. So the impact is the boss can have an enormous impact on whether that team is engaged. We did a big study 10 years ago of one of Australia's most famous retail store enterprises, and it was the store manager that had the biggest impact on employees. A good store manager only had 10% staff turnover. A bad store manager had 70% staff turnover. It was so black and white. The third dot point, if you are disengaged, half the time you're going to share your misery. You drink vinegar for breakfast, you suck lemons for morning tea, you've got a complaining disposition, and that really upsets the good co-workers who are saying get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus if we're going to drive this bus forward. I finished here with a little question. Is it worse this year because of COVID? The whole experience of working from home, what motivates me, how do I stay engaged? For some jobs, it's a very hot market at the moment. There's a lot of money being thrown around. And I just wonder whether disengagement has become an even bigger issue for us. And even studies that show if one person leaves, it could be a $50,000 cost to the business in terms of replacement fees. So here's some research, and I've got to thank Lynne Cruickshank and Dr. Lynne. All her research makes me look good, so you've got to love someone that can help me out. We've got nearly 18,000 360s in our database. We can also correlate that with the personality assessment. What Lynne and I did was look at one category of leadership, namely CEO, C-suite, board leaders, and we picked the top 25th percentile. In other words, at 75 percentile and above. So what do the very best senior leaders look like? And it just blew us out of the water to see what the data was showing. So here we go. Leading edge research. High performing leaders, they do 4 things. They've got a very strong achievement focus. They're passionate about goals. They drive the strategy. They set the KPIs. They want to deliver on the purpose and strategy and values of the organisation. And it fits in with Jim Collins, who wrote the book Good to Great. He said the best leaders are passionate about purpose. They're passionate about impacting people's lives. And that's how we see the achievement focused alongside the strategy. What's the strategic piece? Setting a 5-year plan, a 1-year plan, having your strong operating cadence with the quarterly reviews. So the strategy stuff is working on the business, not in the business. It's the big picture. Inspiring picks up keywords like motivational, engaging, passionate, intense, and then emotional intelligence was all around resilience, social skill, and also being motivated too. So I've written down the bottom, these competencies can be learnt. In fact, the best leaders are the best learners. So we think with our research here, any coaching we do, any leadership programs we run, we love to focus on these 4. Even your high potentials and emerging leaders need to develop competencies in these 4 areas. And it can be hard. So if you take an engineer, for example, in their 20s, they're trading on cognitive skill and technical experience. They don't get taught these 4 competencies here. Yet by the time they're 33, they could be running a very significant project worth $1 billion, and they'll need to demonstrate these capabilities. So let's take the first 2. I call the achievement focus and the strategic as being passionate about performance. How do we impact people's lives? And I can't stress that concept enough. A business should not just be a business. We exist for a purpose. We want to be an industry leader. We want to be successful. And it comes down to the utility of what we do. How do our products and services serve humanity and communities? So the actual words here are from our Hogan 360. So the achievement focus picks up competitive and determined, assertive and energetic, driven, sets high expectations. That's the competencies we see under this heading. Strategic, thinking long-term, being visionary strategic, communicating that vision, driving innovation and fresh thinking, So these are all the hallmarks of what great leaders at that C-suite 75th percentile demonstrate. Then we need to see a different form of passion. So I'll move on to the next slide, passionate about engagement. So we want passion about performance, passion about engagement. Put simply, you cannot achieve your dream except through people. So you've got to take people on that journey, that magic carpet ride. So we expect our leaders to show that they're inspiring, passionate, motivational, caring about morale, positive attitude, externally focused by looking at the customer lens. And there's our definition of emotional intelligence. We think it's a really cool one, calm and even-tempered, very self-aware, good people skills, making people feel valued, even friendly, warm and thoughtful. So obviously, for those on the call today, you can think of some great managers you've seen who are very emotionally intelligent, and you might have seen the odd doctor, a great doctor, but lacked a bedside manner, and that would be the absence of EQ. All right, for those of you who are Hogan devotees, you've done your certification and you love the assessments, I thought I'd share some insights. The HPI ambition scale is primarily there to measure leadership potential. Whether you're confident, competitive, driven, you love to be in a position of authority, you can do public speaking. It was designed to pick up the natural level of leadership that one might have. Now, that's not to say, I'll repeat, not to say leadership can't be learned. I've got some terrific leaders that have got low ambition scores, but they've had to use deliberate practice, build new mental muscle so that these skills become second nature. So what were the correlations with HPI ambition with our 14 360 competencies? We have 14. They were engaging, which we touched on, strategy and innovation. So there is a beautiful correlation between the HPI ambition, which is measuring leadership, and the correlations with the 360. What was interesting in engaging is colourful from the HDS trumped ambition by 001. It was almost like a dead heat in a Melbourne Cup. Strategy, ambition clearly won, but notice colourful was second. Innovation, ambition just ahead of imaginative. So there's imaginative doing its job, thinking outside the box, and colourful was third. So our research shows that HPI ambition has the highest correlation with HDS colourful. Bob Hogan, if he was here, would say that colourful is social charisma, energy, motivation, passion, enthusiasm, superior communication skills, stronger customer focus, and a passion around the big picture. So there are some of the scales. Notice interpersonal sensitivity appeared in all three. We used to narrowly define interpersonal sensitivity as just social skill, but I'm convinced now it contains an influencing component. It's not just that I get along, I can encourage people to get ahead as well. So I hope you like that little data. And a little bit more data. I know we're taking a super big dive, but I wanted to give you something a bit fresh that we've never shared before. We then looked at the subscale correlations from HPI, HDS, and MVPI. So you remember we've got the scales, and then we have the subscales sitting in all three. So you can see what were the biggest predictors of being an engaging leader. You can see what drives someone who's got strategic DNA. And then you can see what are the advantages that are going to help someone to be more innovative. I've colour-coded them, and there are 5 that were sitting in all 3 boxes. So those 5 would give us a secret insight, if you like, into what's the essence of leadership, if you're blessed with this naturally. Otherwise, we've got to learn it through practice. So I'll give you a bit of an analysis now. The 5 are public confidence. If you're going to be a strategic leader and drive the organisation forward, we want to see public confidence on display. We want to see self-confidence, that you're self-assured. It comes naturally to you. Leadership, a no-brainer. You put your hand up for a position of authority. You actually love leading a team. You would prefer to do that. Competitive, ambitious around results. It's not throwing someone under a bus. It's someone who loves competition, the KPIs, the strategy, the getting ahead. Generating ideas quickly. It's in the inquisitive scale, and typically our research shows that these are innovative and strategic in nature. So there we're getting very granular, but this is showing you more clearly what leadership competencies we want to see on display at work if you're going to get a very good 360. The dark side's also interesting too. I just love the fact that the HPI and the HDFs do their jobs so damn well. So you can see here the red scores are the negative correlations with the final column getting a good 360 score. So on the left-hand side of the 11 HDS scales, across the horizontal axis are the 4 key components of the 360, namely self-management, relationship management, working in, working on, and finally your Hogan score. Excitable always correlates with low adjustment. It's the absence of resilience. People being temperamental, moody, frustrated. Skeptical, they're very shrewd, perceptive, insightful, smart, eyes in the back of their head. They can be critical, sharp, tough love, and even a little bit defensive. Cautious people, we love their integrity. We love their honesty. They're the nicest human beings. They struggle sometimes to show leadership, make decisions, and it's the opposite, really, of ambition in HPI. Reserved, people who put business ahead of people, they can be a little bit tough, task-focused, not always interpersonally sensitive. So the EQ would be missing in someone that had the excitable and reserved, unless they're very self-aware and self-regulating. And the leadership would be absent in someone potentially who's got the high cautious. So the HDS, so we hire for the HPI and we look at the HDS to produce the best version of a person by managing their red flags. Now, great news for you. The Hogans, and we love the Hogans in Tulsa, they've given us a new Hogan competency model. For those of you who would like to learn more about this, please reach out to us. It's great IP. We're prepared to share once we understand the purpose of why you'd like to get hold of it. I just think it's some of the most brilliant research I've seen. Competencies are very popular around the world, the business world, the academic world, and it's the last 2 points here. The Hogan model has 62 competencies. It's all science-based. It's all based on evidence. It gives us scientific acumen, if you like. And we've correlated it to the personality assessments. So let me give you a quick insight here. The 62 competencies are all mapped to HPI, HDS, and MVPI. Here's the great news. 56 of the strongest correlations are with the HPI. So the HPI is doing its job. It's predicting the behaviours that are going to help us in life. In the HPI, ambition had a lot of correlations. So we're seeing that leadership, obviously, is one of the most popular competencies in the world. And the definition of ambition, it correlates with competitive leadership, which we define as being achievement-focused, strategic and inspiring. We also looked at HPI adjustment, interpersonal sensitivity and prudence, and they're very predictive of high EQ behaviour. So Bob Hogan talks about getting along, which would be the EQ, and getting ahead, which would be the ambition. Now here's the hot news, hot off the press. 55 of the 62 competencies where there were low scores, they were with a high HDS scale predicting derailment tendencies. So both those assessments are brilliant and are doing their job. Just a little bit of information here. This was the HCM, HPI correlations. Adjustment stood out, and the key word for adjustment would be resilience. Ambition was the biggest. It's all about the confidence and the drive. Sociability only featured in 4 with the highest correlation. Interpersonal sensitivity had 6, and it was around people skills. But I've got to give a plug to interpersonal sensitivity. It had the 2nd highest correlation with adjustment in predicting resilience and people skills. Prudence was about conscientiousness. You know, you love prudent people, don't you? You know, they're there to do the governance, manage the risk, keep us out of jail, do a really, really good job. So adjustment and interpersonal sensitivity are predicting the EQ, and ambition is predicting the drive, and prudence the conscientiousness and business life. There's the highest correlations of the 62 with ambition, which we define as leadership. So you know what's interesting? This gives us a fresh lens on what is leadership. What are the competencies that we want to see in great leaders? What are the competencies we want to teach if it's a leadership program? What are the leadership competencies we want to coach if we're doing a coaching program? There they are. I think that's terrific information to have. Then we look at the EQ. It's essentially adjustment and interpersonal sensitivity. Prudence lends a hand as well, but essentially it's these two. So if you're looking for a fresh lens on EQ, these descriptors are just awesome. Okay, let me talk about some new research. I just love this research from London, Executive Coaching for Results. If you Google it, you'll find it. It's the most sophisticated research on the executive coaching trends around the world. And the good news is that coaching is growing. And why is coaching growing? Because we want to have better leaders who deliver better results. That's essentially the premise. So what's happening with the 360 market? The 360 market is growing. It's changed from 15 years ago where it was a one-on-one, confidential, just feedback, no development plan, no sharing, no repeat 360. It's now an holistic HR tool. I've got people using it for pay reviews. It's on the table during your annual performance management review. I had a client recently restructure and downsize, and they were candid. We said we're looking at the 360 results to help inform that. So it should be a mainstream HR practice. The coaching trends, most companies are signing up for 6 to 12 months contracts with multiple touch points of the coaching. Typically we use 360s. Point 2, for senior managers, the coaching is normally an external certified, experienced professional where there's a good chemistry fit. And we often involve the manager of the manager in 1 or 2 of those sessions. And we encourage the manager to share their 360 results with their team. Be authentic, be open, be vulnerable, be trusting. And 12 months on, we like to repeat the 360. What are the major focus areas for building new competencies? It's executive presence. The good news is executive presence is not just building narrowly defined gravitas. How do I look? How do I present? Do I give eye contact? It's much more about that. It goes back to our C-suite top 75th percentile. Achievement focused, strategic, inspiring. Now, we want to see someone who can drive the business and have the executive presence to take people on a journey. Emotional intelligence is the second most popular competence in the world that's being taught. Getting along with people. And Daniel Goleman said, it's 80% of your success in life. Influencing others. And remember, I talked about HPI ambition and interpersonal sensitivity as the two biggest influences here. Vision and strategy, I love, and it just shows you that a lot of leaders, like I said, the engineer that's born with technical ability and strong acumen, how then do you set the vision for the company? So there are 4 areas that PBC loves to play in, and that's where most coaching interventions are aimed at. We're also seeing that 92% of coaching interventions use a 360 and 71% use Hogan personality. I was so proud to see that number on Hogan. It's far away ahead of any other psychometric test in the world. And the little coach source quote there says Hogan's are growing dramatically, which is wonderful because we're biased, but we think it has the greatest validity and reliability and impact. The other trend that's being used is we're using both personality assessments with the 360. It's the cheapest, most effective, most powerful way to measure a person's reputation or brand at a point in time. And I've got one of my famous little quotes at the bottom of the slide. If you've got both personality and 360, there's no place to hide. I absolutely love having those 2 sets of data. So there's the Hogan, the bright side, the dark side, the inside, and the quote down the bottom, understanding the real self is the key to achieving the ideal self and the foundation stone for becoming the best version of yourself, which all of us should aspire to. The Hogan 360, good news here. We've just done a market review of how we stuck up against others, and these were where we matched or were better than other providers in the marketplace. We have absolute confidence, hand on heart, that our 360 is second to none in the marketplace. It's in business language. It's user-friendly. It's very powerful. It gives you a score. It's got the benchmarks. And Lynne Cruickshank's done a wonderful job with all of the technical manuals to support it. Customised 360s are big. They're growing. A lot of people say we want to have our own competency model. A, think about approaching us and using the Hogan competency model. B, think about approaching us and say which items have to be in there, because we know at the core of a 360 what you've got to be testing for. But please don't build a house of cards. It's got to have a technical manual, validity and science. It's got to come from a proven bank of items. Otherwise, you're just not going to have a successful coaching or leadership program. The future of 360s, the 360 market is growing. I'm thrilled. It's straight out one-on-one coaching or leadership programs. The second point, the better companies are looking at return on investment. Did we change the performance behaviour of the leader? Did they build a high-performing team and drive employee engagement? Did they achieve their KPIs? Did they get career advancement? And in that is the whole concept of people and business analytics getting more sophisticated with the data. The third dot point, just remember leadership can be learned. It takes motivation, deliberate practice, new mental muscle. Eventually the confidence and competencies go up and we are a better version of ourselves. A big new announcement from PBC. I'm so proud, really, really proud. I've had this little vision for several years. We are formally launching a coaching practice inside PBC. A big call out to Lee Wallace. She's joined our team just recently, a few months ago, as head of coaching and development, and she is putting together probably the most sophisticated, qualified, experienced coaching network of associates. So we want to formally join our coaching arm to our assessment arm. We've been doing coaching for 20 years. I started at the Melbourne Business School many moons ago. It's just we're not known in the marketplace for coaching. We're more known for assessments. But put the two together and we've got a wonderful value proposition to bring to our clients. So next year we'll be out and about, I think, doing a lot of coaching and adding a lot more value to our clients. High-performing teams, just briefly, the team is the unit of expression of the leader. Here's our quote: leadership is about results. Teams deliver results. Judge the leader by their team. Do you like that quote? It's resonated with a lot of my coaching sessions this year. So the actual leader then starts to focus on what I can do with my team. There should be two things that we focus on with our high-performing team assessment. We obviously want to produce a team that performs, and they do that through having an enabling culture. So when we focus on teams, it's all about delivering hard-nosed outcomes, but doing it through a culture of trust and emotional intelligence. A bit of research. We have 15 items in our team report, and we ask people to pick the top 4 that would most improve their team. The research shows these are the 6 biggest challenges for teams today. So any of you who are working in teams or working with teams, here's a little checklist to discuss with those teams. More collaboration is the number 1 issue. We still have silos, people doing their own thing. Tackle the difficult issues. We don't put we don't call the elephant in the room out or put the dirty laundry on the table. More accountability. We're still relying on the boss to do the accountability. It should be the peers. Improving communication, sharing, being open, setting priorities. Too often we change the goalpost, we get lost. And number 6, clearer vision, strategy and goals. So many teams are not clear about their purpose, which is terrible. Now, imagine having a team and we don't know what we're here to do. So there's lots of work to do with teams, and we do love working in that team space. Here's a final quote from Dr. Hogan about the importance of teams. And I just love the pithiness of Bob's quotes. And that's my final slide. Leadership in teams are measurable, improvable. That's my passion in life. That's what I do. And PBC would love to support you if you're interested in doing some of that work too. Thank you so much. And back to you, Jo.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so that wraps up today's session. I think we've got a few minutes to spare, so if there are any questions, we're happy to open up for a couple of minutes to the floor. Josh, anything on the chat that we need to?
Nothing in the chat, Joe, but I am dropping in key contacts if anyone wants to reach out as well.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So as Josh says, we will be making available to you the resources from today's session, so that we, if you know PBC, you do know that we have lots of white papers, thanks Lynne, lots of research, and obviously we've got our consultants here ready to answer any questions as well. So give us a buzz. We hope that you all have a safe and happy holiday season, and we are really, really looking forward to seeing you all in person, which will be amazing, hopefully, all being well next year. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you soon.